Thank you, JF. Bonjour. That's going to be the extent of my French, and I apologize in advance for not being able to present in French. I'm going to talk a little bit about who Standard Solar is very briefly, and then I'm going to talk about some of the solar projects that we're familiar with, and then I'm going to show you some real-life examples of community solar projects that we've currently own that are successful. And then I'm going to try to relate some of that, how that might work for Quebec in the long term. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. Standard Solar has been around since 2004, which is a long time for a solar company. We focus on mostly the distributed generation space, so 20 megawatts or below is kind of where we play in the solar space. We're fully owned by Énergétique. They acquired us about 3 years ago. We're currently in 16 states, and we'll show a map of that in the future. So, as I said, these are the typical kinds of projects that we develop and own, from rooftop to canopies to parking structures to ground mounts. We do some small scale, what you might consider small scale utility. Small scale utility would be a 10 or 20 megawatt size facility, but it's interconnected directly to the grid. And that's important just because that's kind of what community solar is in some aspects. Community solar is a lot of things, but that's one of the things that it is. Here's where all of our projects currently reside in the U.S. We're currently only in the U.S. Prior to the acquisition, we did a lot of engineering, construction, and procurement, and we did do a couple of projects outside the U.S., but currently we're primarily focused in the U.S. To add these assets. We own all of these assets, and our mandate from Énergétique is to diversify the portfolio mix of the Énergétique family of assets. This is the process, so we're cradle to grave. We enter the process as early as possible. We do use partners, other developers, to accelerate our project growth. But then we see those all the way through operations. So as we finance, build, and own these projects, we also perform all of the O&M on the projects to make sure that we get the most out of the projects once they're built. Okay, that's enough about Standard Solar. Now let's talk about what we're all here to talk about, which is community solar. So community solar, JF talked about it briefly, but basically the concept of community solar is there's a solar field somewhere. It could be on a roof, it could be in a field, but it allows folks that wouldn't otherwise be able to participate in the solar industry and being an off-taker of that power by centralizing it and then being able to sell the electricity or utilize that energy that's coming off the solar panel. So there's a couple of different models we're going to talk about. There's really three basic models. So one, and the one we do, which is the most common in the US, is where somebody like Standard Solar owns the solar farm. There's an aggregator. It could be Standard Solar, it could be a third party, goes and sells subscriptions to that solar farm. And then the utility usually credits the owner of the solar farm with the energy it produces, and then we distribute those credits to the subscribers of the solar farm. That's the most common model in the US. A couple other models are utility-owned community solar farms. That's where the utility will own it. It's a similar concept. They sell that electricity out to their rate base, usually through the same kind of mechanism where they subscribe to that solar farm. And then the last one, which is much more rare, and it was more in the very early days of solar, but it could be viable in Quebec, is where people subscribe to the solar farm, but they're subscribing to own a piece of that solar farm. So they actually make a contribution, equity contribution into the solar farm. They own whatever it is, 20 panels on that solar farm, and then they're able to benefit from that. That's not popular in the US for several reasons. The biggest being in the US, it's a investment tax credit incentivized program, and so you have to be an active participant to take advantage of those tax credits. And if you're a passive participant, then you can't benefit from those tax credits. So in that scenario, they wouldn't otherwise be able to monetize the incentives that are there in the US. So here's a couple of the structures. As I said, this is what we're currently utilizing. We don't do any of the subscribing in-house. We utilize third-party subscribers. Those companies are out there knocking on doors, canvassing neighborhoods, and asking if they want to sign up to these programs. In almost all of our cases, we save the off-taker money. So it's becoming more and more rare where people are doing it for the green aspects of it. That's a very nice byproduct of what we do. But almost always, every single deal, whether it's community solar or not community solar, it's usually because people are saving money. The typical model for community solar in this scenario is about a 10% discount on what they'd otherwise be paying from the distribution utility for their power. So that's pretty common across all states where we're actively doing community solar. And that applies both to residential and to commercial off-takers, because you do have both. And we'll talk a little bit in some of the examples of those different models. This is the same but slightly different. New concept, the community choice aggregators. That's very popular in California right now. The community choice aggregators are basically where a group gets together and they do the purchasing for the members of this CCA. So they're leveraging their volume to negotiate a better deal for their customers. Becoming quite popular in California. It was a little problematic in the beginning because they're not a solid credit offtake to be a counterparty to contracts. However, we've started to figure out ways to get around that and make them financeable, so it's become much easier. Here's where we own our community solar projects. You can see we've got a lot going on in especially Colorado, Minnesota, and New York is where our bulk of our community solar projects are. The reason for that isn't because it's better sun in Minnesota, it's because their policies are better. Both Colorado and Minnesota are through Xcel Energy, and they've got very good policies towards community solar. Okay, we're going to look at two specific states because there's really, these two represent about 90% of the programs, or at least cover 90% of the aspects of the program. So I picked two states, New York and Colorado, to focus on because they have two different types of community solar programs. So New York came out with a program. They've got this huge, ambitious program to be 100% neutral. I forget what year it is, but they're going to have a hard time getting there. They won't meet their mandates unless they change their policies. That's clear to everybody who's involved. And now it's how do we change the mandates or the policies to get to the mandate. And there's a lot of work going on in a lot of states. And that's the key challenge that I think also Quebec has is with as much hydro as you have here, how does solar fit into the mix? And we'll talk a little bit about that in the near future. So New York does what they call a VEDR. So the VEDR is trying to assign a value to what the distributed aspects of a solar park bring. So most of these community solar facilities are located closer to the load. So basic physics, the energy is going to go to the closest load source. So by placing these distributed amongst the grid, it actually brings resilience to the grid if done properly. You will hear utilities talk about how it's difficult to manage, and especially in places like Massachusetts where you had huge adoption of solar, it did put a strain on the grid. So you have to do it the right way, and you have to manage it correctly. And if you have super rapid growth, you have to be prepared to manage that. Places like Germany, who experience that super rapid growth, were able to manage through it. So we know it's possible. It's just really the will of the people and the will of the utility to support the will of the people is about 90% of the battle. So in this Veeder stack, you can see here they have different values for the different components of the solar as it's generated. And what they do is they run this calculation, they credit our account, Standard Solar owns a solar array, they credit the account this value, and then we go out and we sell a discount, so they're giving us a monetary value, not a kilowatt production kilowatt hour credit. They're giving us a dollar value. So they'll say, okay, your 10 megawatt solar farm is going to produce X number of kilowatt hours. We're going to calculate that in this formula, and we're going to give you a credit. So here's your $100,000 credit for the month. And then we take that credit, and then we spread it across 4,000 residential customers. And in the example I'm going to use, it's 100% residential. We spread that to 100% of the residential customers, and then the next month they'll see on their utility bill the credit coming from the solar array, which roughly equals 10% discount to what they would have otherwise paid to the utility. And then they mail us a check through our aggregator. So it's a little cumbersome in terms of the mechanics, and it's tough to explain to a customer, especially a residential customer, hey, we want you to sign up to the solar farm. We're going to save you 10%. That's the good news. The bad news is you're going to receive 2 bills, and it's a little confusing on how you're going to interpret these bills. So that's one of the big challenges with community solar. One of the things that's changing in New York is they were just mandated by the Public Service Commission for the utilities to look at taking over the back office management of the community solar projects, and then customers that subscribe to solar farms would receive 1 bill from the utility. The utility would manage it. They would charge us a fee, which quite frankly I'm fine with because it's more efficient than what we're currently doing. So when that happens, it'll make the adoption, I think, much easier for all parties concerned, whether it's the offtake, the residential customer, or it's us who own the solar array. One other thing I'll note on this program, they usually offer some kind of either mandate for low-income families, or they offer incentive to sign up lower moderate income families. So that really, in the community solar projects we own, that allows folks that would otherwise not be able to participate in the solar movement to participate. So that's important to us, and I think that's a good side of what community solar brings. Early adoption in the US of solar was wealthy folks who could afford to invest the money for the solar. They would benefit from the savings and the tax credits, and it left the low income and moderate income folks from being able to benefit from this movement. Okay, so this is a project we own. This is right outside Alberta in New York. As I said, it's 100% residential, so it's roughly 3,000 customers that are subscribed to this, fully subscribed. And as I said, we being the aggregator that we've hired to do that work for us, has to every month submit an allocation to the utility, who manually enters it into their system to apply the credit. So it's a very inefficient system, and as more and more community solar projects come online in New York, it's clearly not sustainable. So they have to figure that out, which they're working to do. And one of the solutions would be the utility to take over that subscription management process. It's a great array. What's also nice about this array is I think it was around 7 megawatts. But one of the challenges with a lot of renewables, and you probably heard it in previous sessions, whether it's utility scale solar, it's wind, in the US we call it NIMBYism, where people don't want this in their backyard, right? They're all for solar. It's like 93% of Americans say we want solar. However, when you say we're going to put this in your backyard, then they're like, no, we love solar, but we don't want that in our backyard. So that's one of the challenges that we have as we develop these projects. What's great about this is this was a farm that had very poor soil. However, the section that we built on had very poor soil. The rest of the farm was very productive and still producing. And so that was one of the great benefits of this solar array. And it's also, you can't see it from any road or really any house. The only only people who can really see this array is an old GE facility where they were doing nukes. So the nuke people can now look at our solar array, which we're really happy about. And I'm pro-nuke, but we're happy to see that. Okay, I'm going to talk next about Colorado, because this one's slightly different. So in the New York model, they used dollars to credit us. So they did this calculation, and they tried to take into consideration capacity value and the distributed nature of the solar array and different times during peak power when it's more valuable. So they did, that was the goal of the VEDA rate. And in Xcel Energy, it's a straight kilowatt hour credit. So I generate 1 kilowatt hour, I get a 1 kilowatt hour credit to us. I give the subscriber 1 kilowatt hour at whatever rate they're paying. They're just getting a kilowatt hour off their bill. So it's essentially like a virtual net metered project, where it would, if it was connected to their grid, it would spin their grid backwards as it produced. In this case, it's virtually credited as a kilowatt hour. And that's a big difference between the two programs. This one is very simple to understand. It's simple to explain to off-takers. So it's a different program, and that's why I wanted to highlight these two different programs. Also, this program, I selected this particular project because this is 100% subscribed to what I would say non-residential off-takers. So we subscribe businesses, corporations, and we also have a low-income component to this particular project, and we achieve that low income through housing authorities. So instead of going to the individual low-income off-taker, we went to the housing authority that manages the whole low-income housing development, and they're our counterparty for the PPA, and then they give that benefit to their residents. So it's a little unique in that regard as well. It's in Colorado, as I said. Colorado's got great irradiance, so it's a good place to build solar. And it's been a real successful program. It's one of the early programs in Colorado, so we're awfully proud of that program as well. Here's more about their, I went through a lot of this already, but it's Xcel Energy. One nuisance of Xcel Energy is they don't call it community solar, it's a community solar garden. And then here's the requirements to be able to participate. And this is common in most places, and it's also one of the limitations of community solar, being that you have to be co-located to where the solar farm is built. So you can't live anywhere in Colorado and participate in the solar farm. You have to be in the same county as the solar farm exists. So you can imagine in places like New York, where there's huge load centers in New York City, cheap land in western New York. You can't build a big solar farm in western New York and sell it as a community solar project to New York City. Now, there is talk of changing that, and the only way they meet their mandates is to allow that. It's the same thing in Xcel's program in Minnesota, where you have to be, you can be in an adjoining county to participate, but you can't be in a big urban load center and participate in a project that's 3 counties away. That's currently what's changing in the community solar in the US, is to allow everybody within the distribution utilities footprint to be able to participate in a solar project, and that will open up a lot more subscribers to these projects. It's one of these where you have to click through. So we built this, as I said, it was a good project, 10.3 megawatts, so it's one of the largest at the time in Colorado. This is a typical size now for community solar projects. This wasn't on a single site, it was multiple sites that equaled to 10.3 megawatts. And that's all I really wanted to go over, and at the end I think we're going to do some questions, but I'll turn it over to Jeff and Fred.
All right. No, this is working good. Good morning, bonjour, everybody. Glad to be back in Quebec. I have never been in Quebec City, so it's really nice to be here. When I was growing up in grade school, high school. I spent almost a year in Quebec, but only a month at a time because our family went up to vacation in the eastern townships every year for quite a few years. I remember listening to the traffic reports on CJAD and listening to the Expos games in French. You can tell how long ago that was. The last time I was in Quebec was in 2005 at the UN Climate Conference, where I got to meet some interesting people from Sierra Club of Canada and from Greenpeace in Canada. Those people you may have heard of. The Sierra Club director, Elizabeth May, has gone on to be a member of Parliament, leader of the Green Party. She's now stepping down. And Stephen Guilbeault, is now a minister. He's got the Heritage Ministry. I think maybe someday he might be Environment Minister. But I've worked with them continuously through the last 15 years in the UN climate process, but not in Quebec. I'm really glad to be back here. So in Oregon, we have a new community solar program. I'll talk a little bit about our background and then specifically about the program. This is a kind of a case study of the development process. We are just at the point of opening the program. So this might be relevant in that sense, although there are many differences between Quebec and Oregon. Nonetheless, I think there may be some interesting aspects to what we're doing. In the Northwest, we also have a hydro-based system. It's not as dominant as in Quebec. About almost 50% of our electric power is hydro. It's a joint U.S. and Canadian resource. Much of our storage is actually in Canada, three very large Columbia River Treaty dams, and both BC Hydro and the Bonneville Power Administration and some of our local utilities distribute the hydropower throughout the region, but it's about half. It's not like Quebec, it's where it's almost everything. We also have some coal, which is now coming out of the mix, a fair bit of gas. We have a lot of wind. We don't have much solar, but that is starting to change. Going the wrong way here. There we go. The Northwest Energy Coalition certainly supports community solar, and now we're starting to move forward on it. It's interesting that the definition of community solar is kind of changing, or you can look at it in different ways. We have not decided to adopt a specific definition because it could be community solar is in a specific community, it could be it's offered to a specific community, or it could be sponsored by a community organization, or any of those. And so we think that that's a good approach. The increased use of renewable energy is a key driver here. It's open to all, so that, as Scott previously mentioned, an important thing to us is the equity aspect, so that those who contribute to the power system through their electric bills are able to get the benefits, but have not previously, many have not been able to be solar users, including myself as a renter, but yet long-time solar advocate. Because I can't put it on my roof, I don't own the building, and those who have low income and perhaps their roofs are not facing the right way. National estimates in the U.S. are about half, or maybe even as many as 2/3 of all households are not really capable of doing solar on their own properties. So this opens up the market a great deal in that sense. And also the idea, as Scott described very clearly, is this can provide a tangible economic benefit to customers to invest in solar directly. And finally, we can talk about the other aspects of ownership, of increased employment, of developing local resources instead of being dependent on faraway sources of fossil fuel. The Oregon Community Solar Program was established 4+ years ago by state law. It was part of a broader law that creates an increased renewable portfolio standard and sets a deadline and end point for coal, what we call coal by wire. There's one coal plant in Oregon that's retiring the end of this year. The rest of our coal coming into Oregon is in other states, so that will end in 2030. But there are other provisions in the bill, including the community solar aspect. We've adopted the Colorado model that Scott described, also Minnesota, often called a community garden model, which involves a bill credit on your utility bill. So the customer goes and signs up with a project's sponsor. They may be the owner of the project developer, or maybe they have another company like Standard that does that. The project sponsor could be a community organization, it could be a business. It could even be a utility. Our utilities may be doing some community solar. We have that model in mind because nationally it looks like that's the model that can get the most results. The Colorado and Minnesota models are producing a pretty high amount of early development. This is still an early program, but we think that model could be very important for us in Oregon. The oversight by our Oregon regulator, Oregon Public Utility Commission, as I said here, program development is complete. I'll talk a bit about the project certification process. The project certification for new projects opened just 3 weeks ago, so we now have some early results on that, and I'll talk about that. And then we expect that subscriptions will start actually by the end of this month, and open period for subscribers to be recruited into the program, and we expect that there will be projects online operating by the fall. Keep going the wrong direction here. A little bit about Oregon. This is the map of our utility territories. We have 3 investor-owned utilities, and we have a lot of small publicly owned utilities, municipal utilities, what we call public utility districts and cooperatives. They're not directly in this program. They can do their own. But the 3 main utilities in Portland area here in green is Portland General Electric. There's a portion of Portland actually that's not really visible on the map. That's also Pacific Core, Pacific Power. But Pacific Power is spread out throughout the state, as you can see in the Northeast, along the Columbia River, on the coast, all the way down into southern Oregon. That's actually a very important difference. And we have a little bit of Idaho Power, which is actually obviously mostly in Idaho. On the far eastern side, there's only about 20,000 customers though, so it's quite small. But those 3 utilities are under the Oregon Community Solar Program. One of our public utilities, the city of Ashland, actually developed probably what we think was the first true community solar project in the U.S. in 2007. They actually did a small project even a couple of years before that. So we already have some community solar in Oregon, but it's not very big. Our solar resource is quite an interesting aspect. You know that Portland is a rainy place, just like much of the West Coast, so certainly Seattle and Vancouver, but the east side is quite good for solar. It's not quite as good as Arizona or Southern California, but as you can see from the map here, it's some of the better solar resource in the U.S. actually. As a result, we have an issue in that I'll talk about more later, where the load centers are on the west side where it's not sunny, and the resource is more on the east side. I won't go through all this in detail, but we've been through a very long 7-year basically process to develop this program. It takes quite a while. There are many pieces. It's complicated to do this, and we still think it's worth it. But just to give fair warning to anybody who's thinking about doing community solar, there are many, many pieces to fit together. It's kind of a jigsaw puzzle. We had a period where we had organizations that got together informally and talked about the concept, went to our legislature, got it included in the legislation, and now a 3-year, basically 3.5-year process of regulatory development, which has now resulted in the opening of the program just this past month. There's a lot of documentation, so if anybody in Quebec is interested in this, I recommend you go to our Oregon Public Utility Commission and our Community Solar Program website. There's a tremendous amount of material about all the different development aspects. Some of it is relative only to the U.S. in our regulatory context, things on interconnection queues and issues with the FERC national jurisdiction versus the state jurisdiction. But many of the issues, in particular things about access for low income, might be of use to others, and we certainly hope you'll take a look. First, basic elements of the program. First, the Oregon PUC has set a limit, the cap on the program of 2.5% of retail load in this cycle. That could be extended in the future. They've subdivided that also into an initial program tier, half for the 2 large utilities, and all for Idaho Power is very small in Oregon, so they don't need they didn't divide it up. 50% of PGE is about 50 megawatts I guess 45 megawatts. For Pacific Power, the 50% is about 30 some megawatts. I will jump a little bit ahead here and say on January 21st, when the program opened, PGE's 45 megawatts was oversubscribed immediately. They actually had to run a lottery to choose the initial projects. So that's a good sign. We know there's a strong interest. There was not as much for Pacific Power, but they did have quite a bit of entries. So we're off to a good start in that we know the project pipeline is primed, is ready to go. So anyway, so that's the initial program tier, part of the initial overall program cap. We will, and the reason to do this is we want to make some adjustments. This complicated program, and learning by doing is a very important thing Oregon is committed to. So instead of just opening up the program and totally, we want to fine tune it as we go forward. So that's the reason for the initial program, 50% program tier. The program is a typical solar garden kind of concept. We are setting a bill credit rate, that's the rate that the customer receives as a benefit, is a net metering style rate. It's not exactly the retail rate, there's slight differences, but that's basically what it is. The difficulty is that the Oregon law requires that the Oregon Commission set the rate eventually according to what we call the resource value of solar. This is similar to New York, as Scott described earlier. The problem with the resource value of solar is that resource value of solar is also used in places like Minnesota, but they have higher retail rates, and there are other aspects, technical aspects to their resource value, which is set at a much higher level than Oregon has set. But for the moment, we're not doing that. We're setting it at the retail rate. At the retail rate, the data provided by developers to the Oregon Commission on a confidential basis suggests that it's feasible economically, but the resource value of solar rate would make it not feasible. There's also a tier for small projects. This is to allow small community organizations to have a little bit of an advantage to get smaller projects going, to preserve the diversity of the resource development, and also to allow for more direct community involvement. Unfortunately, we didn't see any of those in the January 21 submissions, but that may be because they have a reserved tier, and those groups may be taking a bit more time, but we think there will be quite a few, but it didn't come in right away. So we hope that that will happen. Project size in Oregon ranges from 25 kilowatts to 3 megawatts. Project managers, as I said, can be any kind. The project, the physical project and the subscribers must be within the utility service area. This is similar as Scott described for New York and Colorado. This is actually a real problem. As you recall, Oregon Solar Resource is not, for example, for Portland General Electric, it's all on the west side of Oregon, but the solar resource is spread out. Pacific Power, at least technically, well, Pacific Power customers in Portland could subscribe to a project that was in Hermiston or in Medford, other places in the state that have much better solar resource. But this is a real issue. The geographic diversity is a big issue with financial implications. All customers can be subscribers, so that means not just residential, but also commercial, community organizations, school districts, etc., can all be customers, although there are limits on the subscriptions for the non-residential customers. Additional elements, very important to us, as I mentioned, the low-income mandate. 10% of the program has to be offered to low-income customers. Under the program rules, they have a 10% set aside per project and 5% minimum participation. The idea is in aggregate, we'll get 10% participation. And there are some mechanisms in our process to, for surplus credits to be assigned to a low-income pool that can be assigned that way. And for the low-income customers, they have to receive at least a 20% discount. This is research that was done, showed that this was the level necessary to get participation from low-income customers. There are many aspects to it, so I won't go into those details here. There are also complicated regulatory issues with other programs, renewable portfolio standard, renewable energy credits, and so forth, that I won't go into, that we had a lot to go through. And cost recovery is included in the program so that customers of non-participating customers of utilities will not be affected, and the program administrators will get their several program administrator organizations will get their costs compensated as well. And finally, we have a lot of complicated issues with interconnection. So at the start, we have a multi-hundred megawatt opportunity. The first tier is about 160 megawatts. We think that that could grow to several hundred beyond that over time if we're successful. The program is flexible, transparent, and has accountability. We have a program implementation manual that's worth taking a look at. It's quite long, about 90 pages. We have a commitment to equitable access, and we have some broad support publicly in the public. Utilities, our state, and our local community governments and agencies are very supportive. And of course, we have falling costs for solar, which is a big driver going forward. But we also have some areas for improvement. The bill credit rate at the RVOS level would not be feasible, so we have to fix that. And the second problem we have is back to the issue of geographic access. It's a real burden on the customers. I'm a Portland General Electric customer. I've been in the solar industry, for 40 years. I was in the Oregon Solar Energy Industries Association in 1981 when we formed the Northwest Energy Coalition, and I've never had solar. So I'm really looking forward to this program, but I'm not looking forward to not getting the full value of my dollars given the resource available in Oregon. So that's an issue we have. We also have an issue in Willamette Valley, which is Portland south to Eugene, Oregon, basically, a lot of farmland that's been reserved under our land use system, but unfortunately there's a conflict between our land use and our energy goals in Oregon, and there's now a restriction that effectively prohibits the development of community solar projects on Willamette Valley farmland. So earlier today with the photo of the contented cows and the solar panels, I was thinking, we should probably take that concept back to Oregon. So we have some things to work on for improving the program. If we look across the country, this is a slide from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance in Minnesota, a big proponent of community solar. You can see the accomplishment, the left hand for each of the states. The darker color is the operating capacity in AC megawatts. The orange color to the right is the number of projects. So Colorado has been around for a while. Doesn't have that many megawatts yet, has quite a lot of projects. They're really good. Scott showed a couple of them. They're really good projects. Massachusetts has gone quite a ways. Minnesota and New York. Oregon's first tier would actually be pretty substantial, especially given that we're a smaller state than the other ones. So I think we have a good scope here. And community solar can work everywhere. I was unable to find easily comparable numbers for Portland and say Montreal or this area of Quebec, but I found the local kind of proxy, Burlington, Vermont. So this is the annual, on the left-hand side, the annual solar resource for these areas. Portland, Oregon, and you can see Redmond, Oregon, the east side, a lot better. This area is actually better than Portland. And if you look on the right-hand side, you can see the monthly resource shape. So we know that solar will work well in Quebec, and we also know that there are opportunities here. Considering the issues with Quebec, I thought, the motivations to do this are not just economic. They're also the kind of a cultural or a societal aspect to it. The people in Oregon really love solar, have participated in our green power programs at phenomenal levels where you contribute a little bit extra in your utility bill and the utility buys renewable energy credits. You're not really getting a direct benefit out of it, but it's a good thing. The sense that people want to have solar on their roofs is very strong. The barriers to doing that are pretty considerable, but we think that community solar is a way to implement that. But in Quebec, I was thinking, there's a kind of built into the history here, the heritage here, you have the caisse populaire, which began in the same kind of way as a way of self-help, of promoting a social community benefit, and of seeing where it goes. So I'm hopeful that in not just in Oregon but elsewhere, the notion that people can own part of the resource that helps provide long-term sustainability, helps address the climate issue, and also provides a direct economic benefit, that kind of model, that Quebec, can work with that. You already know how to work with that, and I wish you well. Thank you very much.